these are all of the headlines on the front page of the online version of the New York Times. Judge halts access to Treasury payment system by Elon Musk's team. Musk wields scythe on federal workforce with Trump's blessing. Trump is revoking Biden's security clearance. Trump says he will dismiss Kennedy Center board members and make himself chair. States confounded by Trump administrative move to free EV charging funding. I was like, I don't know what article to start reading.
We are cursed to live in interesting times, Stephen.
This week, a very interesting episode of Socially Democratic with our regular guest, David Feeney. With all that's been happening in Europe and North America, it's easy to forget that the current US administration has been in power for barely over a month. Yes, you heard it right. We have a long few years ahead of us yet. In these times, Australia can seem like the eye of the storm. But how immune are we to global pandemonium? David Feeney dives right in after a word from our sponsors. The presenting sponsor for Socially Democratic is Dunn Street. Dunn Street is a campaign agency that specialises in community organising. We only work with people who want to build power to make the world a better place. And if you want to create change in 2025, then hit us up at dunstreet.com.au. A special shout out to all of our Patreon members as well. And you can join our community for free or for as little as $1.50 a month. And you too can help support this podcast. All paid members receive a welcome gift. So if you have recently signed up, please check your inbox for a message from our producer asking for your shipping address. Because without that, then we can't send you your merch. And finally, today's episode is brought to you by Maurice Blackburn Lawyers. Maurice Blackburn has been fighting for workers' rights in Australia for more than 100 years. They believe the law should serve everyone and not just those that can afford it. So for empathetic and expert legal support, call Maurice Blackburn Lawyers today. All right, let's get on with today's episode. We are taping this one on a Thursday afternoon on the lands of the Wurundjeri people, and it is the end of February, the end of the month. So that means it's time for the Feeney Files. Only feels like it was like a couple of weeks ago that David was on the show, but here we go again. Another month has passed. Mr. Feeney, welcome back to Socially Democratic. How are you?
Always a pleasure. Very well.
It feels quick. This month, I know February is obviously a couple of days short, but it feels like it was a week short.
I agree with you. It does. It's the first working month of the year. At least that's true for me. After holidaying in January, and so it just becomes a kaleidoscope of activity in contrast to the weeks preceding it. And as ever, I'm always behind. So running around like a crazy person. So yeah, February goes very quickly as a consequence. I guess I live in hope that we'll eventually find a steady state and things won't feel like they're going so quickly.
Well, even in what was a short-term month, a lot happened. And so we've got a lot to cover in today's episode. We'll do a bit of Australian politics. I got a couple of questions from our Patreon members. And then we might head overseas and talk a little bit about some of the stuff that's happening both in Europe and the United States. But let's start at home, federal politics. The Labor government made a pretty significant announcement over the month around Medicare and really sort of kind of locking in funding for our health system for the next election cycle at least. And very well received. But I want to get your reflections on it, but I'm also interested in the timing of it. My initial question was, why didn't this come out sooner? And I'm wondering what influenced that decision. Was it, I'd like to hope it wasn't like a last minute kind of, let's get this out the door kind of thing. And if it was intentional to do it now, so close to the election, I'm wondering why. These are the questions I don't have the answers to, but
no, nor do I, but I'm going to wildly speculate, as is my wont.
Do it.
It wasn't a slapdash thing. It didn't look like it was just getting something out the door. It was carefully choreographed. It was done in Tasmania, which is a key region or set of regions for Labor in the upcoming federal campaign. And it had something of an election rally feel about it. There were pre-prepared placards, and Albo was talking to a very friendly audience about this Labor initiative. So it looked to me like it was a a deliberative pre-election announcement, and it looked to me like it was trying to do something dramatic and big so as to shift the conversation back to an area which is a traditional strength for Labor, and that's healthcare and Medicare. And it looked like it was an effort to, I guess, prepare the fields for a federal election later. And I guess my sort of retired political strategist brain thought, well, perhaps what they're trying to do, my old adage, you call an election when you think you can win, they're trying to rebuild the primary vote and rebuild enthusiasm as they try and shape the environment before calling an election. And I thought there were two things about it that I thought jarred, and this might simply be me. It's just my impressions. The first thing was I thought it looked a little bit reminiscent of Labor's federal campaign in 2016, the so-called Medicare election, where we, in 2016, very effectively moved Medicare and saving Medicare to the centre of the political debate. And it's known as Mediscare because our chances of saving it were very high because no one was threatening it. And Malcolm Turnbull was screaming foul for the whole campaign, saying, this is outrageous. Medicare's not under attack. I'm going to preserve Medicare. But no one seemed to care. And Labor achieved its objective and saved Medicare. It lost the election, but Bill Shorten, you'll remember, had a very, very strong result. And it set the scene for him to remain leader. And as they say, the rest is history. So I saw a lot of that. And I thought, well, the problem with this, saving Medicare from Peter Dutton, is it's not immediately apparent that Medicare is under threat from Peter Dutton. He might sort of have the image and the brand essence of the kind of guy who would threaten it, but he hasn't said anything threatening it. And so it looked a little bit like a retread of that 2016 strategy. And I just think, I'm not sure everyone's going to fall for it again quite so quickly. But to make sure that people didn't fall for it again quite so quickly, Peter Dutton did something which was very adroit, which was he marched out and immediately matched it in terms of funding, plus $500 million for mental health. And I think almost killed it dead because it hasn't dominated the airwaves since. And while the announcement was big enough and important enough to have continuing reverberation throughout the health sector and health professionals and people who work in the area or rely on it, it didn't snatch the national conversation back for Labor. So I guess my assessment is that it ultimately didn't do the things that the Labor was hoping the announcement would do, and Dutton was able to dead bat it. And there's a press gallery that are, because they are always the cleverest people in the room, who are determined not to fall for this twice over the course of their long and meandering careers.
Two things I want to pick up there. The first one, to your point about dead batting it, the fact that Dutton and the coalition came out so quickly, they'd already said things before on Medicare in preparing the terrain to ensure that there wasn't going to be that Medicare type campaign anyway. So I feel like they already had that ready. They'd already sort of dropped a couple of things. And then when Albanese came out,
thought, we're not going to get ambushed in this same
yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
And, Malcolm Turnbull, the last guy who got ambushed in here, probably was hoping Peter Dutton would die in the same ambush. There are enough people around Dutton to say, hey, dude, last time we were in here, it went really badly. So let's get out of here straight away.
Exactly. As George W. Bush once said, there's a famous saying in Texas or Kentucky or somewhere, or Louisiana, fool me once, shame on you. Fool me once, fool me twice. Well, the point is the fool can't get fooled again. That's a direct quote by what George W. said.
Eloquent as ever. As George W. Bush said, the French don't even have a word for entrepreneur.
This is stand-up comedy at its best. Try the veal. I'm here all week. The second point is that I want to pick up. You said an election, paving the way for an election later. Do I interpret the word later as in you think it's now going to be further away than what we had initially been?
No, I'm sticking to my May prediction.
Okay, right.
May's several months away. I mean, there was a lot of speculation he was going to call it last weekend. I dare say this is going to happen every weekend.
Yeah.
I don't think he's ready to call the election yet, and the Medicare announcement's proof of that. They want to shape the environment and get themselves into a stronger shape before they call it, and Medicare was part of the strategy to do that, in my view.
No, I agree. And there was some speculation that he would call the election the weekend that's just passed to avoid having the RBA meet during the election campaign in case they made a rate decision that they didn't like. And so they wanted to avoid that. Was a theory. Obviously, that theory has been blown out of the water because they didn't call an election. And I guess the next sort of red hot date we're looking at is the Sunday or the Monday after the WA election, which isn't this week coming, but the weekend coming after. So I'm just, speculating still about.
Yeah, I mean, but there's going to be this hothouse environment where everyone's wondering when the starter's gun's going to come off. And so that means, and that affects the government and its work because now everything's seen through an electoral prism. It means that the media are more inclined than even normal to give Dutton fair time because of this pre-election environment. And the government's going to endure that until an election is forced upon it, or it calls one thinking it can win it. Yeah.
It seems like they are. I mean, they obviously are getting ready. There was media reports in the press last week that they have started doing debate prep, and Daniel Andrews was brought in to assist with the debate prep, which I wanted to wind you up and say, wellity. You told me on the podcast that state politics is not as tough as federal politics, and here's Anthony Albanese bringing in a state politician to give him a hand with debate prep.
You think the fact that he's working as a volunteer staffer proves that the regionals are still as important as the nationals? Is that what you're telling me?
I'm just saying there's plenty of members from his caucus he could pull out of the hat and say, give us a hand with the debate prep, and he went to a state politician.
Okay, well, you keep working on your theory.
Let's turn to Mr. Dutton. He's getting a bit of a blowtorch for a lack of disclosures, I'm wondering, or required disclosures of the parliamentary registry, and defending lucrative property and share investments. And I just think it's interesting that this is happening now. Obviously, it's a bit of, dirty work by the government to get these stories up in the press. Not bad for Mr. Dutton, who's trying to talk about understanding that the pressures of working Australians are going through in terms of cost of living. Meanwhile, he's got to defend himself in terms of the money he's made as a politician over the time he's been in Parliament. And it's also good that they're talking about themselves. Do you think this story's got legs, or do you think this is just sort of something's going to happen for a couple of days and then just move on? Is this a problem for Dutton?
No, and I think it pretty much died on arrival. There's a few reasons why it's not a problem for Dutton. The first is Tories are allowed to be rich. It's Labor people who get accused of hypocrisy if we have wealth. A conservative politician representing the most privileged people and the most vested interests in our society being wealthy, no one bats an eyelid. It's when champions of the working class are wealthy that everyone is free to kick them in the face. So there's kind of a built-in hypocrisy to this argument. That's just an unfair rule. It's a bit like, when the Liberal Party attacks trade unions from government, everyone shrugs their shoulders and says, well, of course they would, wouldn't they? The second reason I don't think it's going to work is, I even heard David Spears give him a leave pass on the fact that some of his late or inadequate disclosures were like 20 years old. And so the media have kind of given him a effectively I guess a leave past or a statute of limitations based on the fact that some of his failings are very old. And I think lastly, he's been able to build something of a narrative around the fact that he's always acted with integrity. I had integrity when I was a police officer. My dad was a builder. We bought houses. We sold houses. That was our job. He hasn't made this money, in terms of your phraseology, he hasn't made this money from politics or on a politician's salary, because, as you well understand, a politician's salary is somewhat more modest than what Mr. Dutton's personal wealth would suggest. So, he had his own story, which I've no doubt is the truth, about, how this family wealth came to be accumulated. So I guess that's a very long-winded way of me saying that I just think it affects Labor and Liberal figures differently. And when, Albo was done for having a $4.3 million house on the coast, everyone was able to sort of poke the fingers at this, Labor politician who had all this wealth. But you remember, Malcolm Turnbull was the richest politician to ever grace the Australian political stage, and no one batted an eyelid.
Yeah,
he donated $1 million to his own re-election in 2016, and no one batted an eyelid. Yeah. Tories get away with it.
We've got some questions from our listeners on our Patreon community. So I'm going to read both of them out, and then sort of they're very, very similar kind of questions. And it goes to more about the sort of the impact that Trump's potentially going to have on the Australian political landscape going forward. First one's from Jason. Hey guys, if David, you took over the campaign, how would you attack Trump amidst the sort of media support for the LNP? And the second question is from Susan. So much has changed over the last 5 weeks. And can you ask David how this might impact our election? Can we draw parallels with the LNP election policy to sack 36,000 public servants and what's happening to the American civil service right now? Thank you, first of all, Jason and Susan, first questions. I mean, broadly speaking, David, the impact that Trump is going to have on this campaign, are you like, I would normally not think I'm worried about that, but in this time I'm just sort of a little bit kind of...
No, he definitely is. You've heard me say before about how this is a government that has had to endure extraordinary distractions, destructive distractions. The first, self-inflicted distraction was the voice. The second lasting distraction was foreign conflict, most especially Gaza, but also the war in Ukraine. And now, the third distraction is Trump. Now, what all these distractions do is they just gobble up all of the media window. And we've talked before about how the political class are just utterly obsessed with the Palestinian cause and the Israel-Palestinian conflict. And so anything in that space has every journalist of left and right completely fascinated, and politicians fall into this trap too. And so while the electorate is left wondering how they're going to pay for their groceries, they're wondering why everyone with influence is charged off to watch a television set about the Middle East. But that's what happens. And Trump is a little bit the same, although maybe broader interest. And so, if you're sitting in the government and you're trying to shape the debate, get the conversation to Medicare, for instance, and Trump that morning has sent out a tweet about Panama or Greenland, or JD Vance has given a speech at the Munich Security Conference saying that wokeism is a bigger threat to Europe than Russia, or, whatever it is, it just steals all of the oxygen in the room. So, we have a globalized media environment, a deep fascination with everything Trump and his regime does, by both his friends and his enemies. And poor old Australian politicians, most particularly our federal government, have really struggled to sustain a narrative of any kind. Now, we can debate whether they ever had one, but so Trump is the great third distraction. The second effect, I think, second order effect of Trump is that it has obviously changed the zeitgeist about a whole range of issues. And so, as Elon Musk audits government through Doge, DEI is abolished across diversity, equity, and inclusion, three very nice words to describe a far more complex program of positive discrimination. As those sorts of ideological issues rage across America, they have after effects in our politics too. It emboldens the right. Even AOC, Anastasia Cortez, the AOC, the very perhaps the standard bearer for the most left-wing parts of the Democrats. Interestingly, after the election of Trump, took her pronouns off her Twitter profile, which is a sign, I think, that at least for parts of the left, they see that things have shifted to the right and they need to readjust, and that's true here in Australia as well. So it means the zeitgeist is better for the right, the global conversation is better for the right, and added to that is a distraction which can just be a wrecking ball through a communication strategy at a moment's notice. You could be in the middle of the most important announcement in the life of this government, and you'll be wiped out by a Trump announcement about Greenland.
So to Jason's question then, if you're running the campaign comms, how do you manage that? How do you adjust?
Yeah, well, Jason's question is terrifying. I'm reminded of that lovely saying that, how do I get to Dublin? Well, you wouldn't start from here. I'm really glad that I'm not taking over the campaign. I'm sure the campaign is rather happy about that too, but I'm glad I'm not taking over the campaign. Well, it's almost a longer conversation. You've got to go back to the essentials, which is who is the audience you're trying to reach, and what are the platforms and programs where you can reach them with subject matter of interest to them. You've got. I don't think Dutton is a try-hard Trump. That's, I think, a little bit simplistic. He hasn't. He's certainly a conservative leader of a conservative party, but he's a traditional figure. He's not the great disruptor that Trump was, but he will. He's got his media support. He's obviously got his media detractors too. I would say that the most important thing the government can do now is continue to assert that it and its economic management has delivered real wins, and that there is light at the end of the tunnel, and now would be a foolish time to change government. And I think there might be, the need for a more considerable discussion about defence and foreign affairs matters, which is normally puts everybody to sleep. But as well as economic insecurity, we now have a sort of a global security insecurity as well, with war, tariff wars, and a very erratic ally in Washington. And I think Labor needs to tell a story about how we're best placed to navigate that. And with that in mind, I have noticed that the story of the Chinese flotilla busy circumnavigating Australia at the moment has not played well for the federal government. It's very unfortunate that Senate Estimates was on, and so the opposition were in a position to cross-examine the Chief of the Defence Force on the detail of Australia's dealing with with this issue, and found certain sort of errors of fact in the Prime Minister's remarks, and have been able to blow that story up in a way that makes the government look clumsy. And that's a space where the government needs to look very deft, actually. So, a very brief story would be Labor came into government, stabilised the relationship with China while keeping faith with the United States, has rebuilt our trade with China across a whole range of valuable commodities, iron ore, barley, lobster, yada, yada, wine, but also strengthened our defence and security relationship with the United States through AUKUS. That's an amazing effort, being able to walk both sides of the street so successfully in international affairs. And Labor should be trusted to continue to navigate Australia through increasingly dangerous seas. That story hasn't really been told, events like this Chinese flotilla circumnavigating Australia doesn't help. It's a little People's Liberation Army gift to the coalition here in Australia, which was not welcome or sought after. Of course, it should be made, the point is that the Chinese flotilla is really a big nothing burger. And people have said to me, wow, what about this Chinese flotilla? And I say, what do you think the Royal Australian Navy does? And where do you think our submarines spend all of their time in Sydney Harbour? Where do you think they're creeping around? Like, what's disconcerting is that this is the first time China's done it in this way in these waters. If it had been an American flotilla or French or whatever, no one would have cared less. They're in international waters, and although it would have been nice if they'd told us, and it would have been nice if 49 flights hadn't needed to manoeuvre around their flotilla as it clumsied its way through the seas, it's just some of the hysteria around this Chinese activity, I think, has been ludicrous, and in some cases by people who should and do know better.
I wanted to move to, and that might be a good segue, I want to move to overseas topics. And I had asked ChatGTP to come up with some names for our segment dedicated to what I would call sort of overseas interests that you, David Feeney, have with global affairs, conflicts, but also I said that this person that I'm asking you to come up with a topic name for also has an interest in ancient history, in particular Carthage. And so ChatGTP came up with a bunch of names for me. One of them was called, so these are the names of the suggested names for the segment: Hannibal's Horizons, The Punic Perspective, Elephants and Empires, The Siege Report, and the last one was Strategos and Taktikos, which obviously is Greek for general and for ranks. And so I've decided to go
strategy and tactics. Yeah.
Strategy and tactics, Strategos and Taktikos. There you go. So that's the name of our segment now, where you can just go nuts, David, and talk about whatever you like. Because obviously your rant on Syria won you a lot of fans the other week. Let Feeney be Feeney. So let's start with Ukraine. Really worrying stuff, having the United States and Russia negotiate the outcome of Ukraine without involving both the Ukraine and also their partners in Europe, in particular NATO. What are you thinking about this? This is scary, right? Or are you more calm about this?
No, I'm not calm about this. I think this is a stain on the honour of the United States that will be felt for generations. It's utterly disgraceful. They're not simply turning their back on an ally. They're not simply ignoring their own strategic interests. The United States is behaving like a bandit. I mean, that contract, for want of a better word, that they put in front of President Zelensky, seeking to essentially gobble up Ukrainian natural wealth in exchange for their military support, was an absolute disgrace. It was the kind of thing that an officer of the East India Company would have been embarrassed to put before an Indian ruler in the 18th century. One analyst calculated that it was more debilitating than the Versailles Treaty had been for Germany at the end of World War One. The US was treating Zelensky and Ukraine like a vassal state, and more than that, a vassal state that was held in contempt.
Yeah.
It was an absolute disgrace, and obviously deeply appalled leaders across European capitals, which is why President Macron of France cobbled together a group of European leaders who made a counteroffer, and that gave Zelensky the leverage to get a better deal out of the US. The counteroffer, I'm sure, was puffery, and Macron probably couldn't make it last longer than a minute, but he did give Zelensky some leverage that he desperately needed. Macron, I think, has consistently handled this situation well, and we are going to miss him when the French electorate finally get rid of him, which they're busting to do, which is a shame. Deeply disgraceful. And of course, as you say, meeting with the Russians to talk about the future of Ukraine without Ukraine present, without any other European leader present, lying, just bald-faced lying by Trump about the extent of US financial support. And Trump talks about US support for Ukraine in a way that suggests that, you know, bullion has been loaded onto ships and dispatched to Kiev as a giant gift card, when in fact what's happened is the US has sent billions of its dollars into its own factories in the United States of America, so that American workers and American capital in American businesses can produce more shells, more planes, more tanks, more whatever, and that those are then given to the Ukraine. So in fact, it's been a giant Keynesian stimulus for the US economy, but there's no mention of that. And of course, there's no mention of the fact that the Europeans have, in total, in aggregate, given more than the United States has. Now, all of that still means that Zelensky's been put in a very, very difficult position, but I don't think an impossible position. But what it does mean for allies of the United States, of which we are one, is that we should be looking at this with appalled eyes, aghast, because there, but for the grace of God, go I. Is the United States now your ally until they're not? This erratic ally who cannot be depended upon. And when an election result delivers a change in Washington, it can deliver the destruction of your nation state at the hands of an avaricious power like Putin and Russia. So an absolute disaster. And I'm very fearful of what it means.
The other thing I wanted to get your reflections on was, and you sort of touched on it earlier in the show, JD Vance spoke at the conference in Munich. Maybe for our listeners that aren't across that, do you want to sort of give some text?
So this is the
Munich to what he said.
This is the Munich Security Conference, and it's a conference with a 70-year history, I think, and brings together political and strategic leaders from across, what might be described as the Western world, and guests, and to consider issues of shared strategic interest. It's a sort of forum where Western leaders would typically get up and give speeches about Western values, and we'd all get to watch a whole bunch of friendly dictators shift awkwardly in the audience. How times have changed. It's now Democrats shifting uncomfortably. So what Vice President JD Vance chose to do, and this is in the slipstream of Trump's most outrageous remarks concerning Ukraine. So that was a scene setter, I guess, for JD Vance when he took the podium. And he gave a speech, which I listened to with great interest. And as ever, I find JD Vance, a pretty eloquent and compelling speaker. And his theme was essentially that the greatest threat that exists to Europe today is not external enemies like Russia or China or whoever else you may nominate, but internal enemies. And those internal enemies are, to wildly paraphrase his speech, immigrants, most especially Muslim immigrants who do not share our values, and their woke collaborators, and there is, and that these forces are oppressing free speech across Western Europe. And he gave an example of someone praying in a prohibited zone around an abortion clinic, and examples of people being trucked off to prison for saying hateful things on the internet. Now, this was JD Vance using the Munich Security Conference to essentially produce a lot of red meat for his American base, for his MAGA base. And it was all, that's just American domestic politics. If anyone was as long-suffering as I, they would have then noticed JD Vance popping up at the CPAC conference in the United States, which is sort of the annual festival of conservatives from across the Western world, where his speech was treated as sheer genius by those who are obsessed with the struggle against wokeism and free speech and so on and so forth. So for the strategic thinkers in the room at the Munich Security Conference, I think people were deeply appalled, most especially the Germans, because, of course, the Germans were at the end of their own election, a very significant election for Germany, and JD Vance, as vice president, had quite pointedly met with the leader of AfD, Alternative for Deutschland, the right-wing party there, and had not met with the chancellor, which is a pretty outrageous bit of signalling in the last days of an election. What it's meant is, and so obviously people were furious about that. I mean, as we would be. I mean, imagine if the Vice President of the United States came here and only met with Peter Dutton. So, you know, you don't have to be clever to work out the significance of these signals. So, of course, in the aftermath of the German election, the Germans have gone bananas. I mean, the new Chancellor of Germany from the centre-right party has essentially indicated that the US alliance with Europe is now terminal, and that European leaders need to come together and start desperately building a new security and diplomatic architecture for themselves. And Keir Starmer, Brexit notwithstanding, is part of that conversation. So JD Vance's foray into European politics was quite significant in the effect it's had on the Germans. The AfD won 20% of the vote in Germany, but that means 80% of Germans didn't vote for the AfD. And we live in a country where, you know, depending on how you count it, the One Nation and UAP voters sometimes plumbed 20%, so we shouldn't get too high and mighty about it. So, you know, 80% of Germany didn't vote for the AfD, notwithstanding Elon Musk and others' entreaties. So, yeah, I think this is all very interesting. And again, with the Ukraine as the big backdrop, and the erratic behaviour of this president who's sort of threatening Panama and threatening Denmark and NATO ally about Greenland, while issuing tariff wars into those meddlesome warlike Canadians. Everyone's just watching this foreign affairs behemoth, and no one knows what it's going to do next. And who wants that as an ally? Yeah. Who wants to have a defence force full of equipment that this guy can turn off?
Let's turn to US politics. And I want to begin by, I screenshotted the front page of the New York Times a week ago or 2 weeks ago. As my want of an evening, I pour myself a whiskey and climb into my favorite armchair and grab my iPad and read the New York Times. And these are all of the headlines on the front page of the online version of the New York Times. Judge halts access to Treasury payment system by Elon Musk's team. Musk wields scythe on federal workforce with Trump's blessing. Trump is revoking Biden's security clearance. Trump says he will dismiss Kennedy Center board members and make himself chair. States confounded by Trump administrative move to free EV charging funding. I was like, I don't know what article to start reading. This is all in one day. One of these headlines is a 3-day story on its own right. And it's just coming at me like a Gatling gun or a blizzard.
It's flood the zone. Isn't that what they're calling it? Flood the zone.
Far out.
I mean, what we're seeing here is that Trump has come to power, in contrast to 2016, come to power with a cadre of people who know exactly what they want to do, who have some experience of government and have worked out what they want to do and how to do it immediately. And so all of these disciples have rushed off to their various agencies and gigs, armed with an executive order, and have just started doing their shit.
Yeah.
And it's all happening at once, and everyone's head is spinning. Yeah, I mean, it is not all of it's bad, I've got to say. You know, we can't let Trump derangement syndrome blind us here. I think his foreign affairs impact has been almost uniformly bad, but domestically, I think that Democrats or anyone would be a fool to get upset about the President of the United States essentially commissioning a vast audit of government, because as Elon Musk and others have done, they'll be able to come up. You'll find yourself defending some pretty stupid programs if you're not careful. Millions of dollars of taxpayers' money to support the design of a Sesame Street program for Iraq. I'd want to be talked through that pretty carefully, and that's not even the worst example that springs to mind, but I'm not going to trigger a politically correct backlash by naming some of the others. The president wields enormous power, the CEO of executive government, able to appoint leaders everywhere with a broad discretion to implement whatever they want to do, and a vast civil service that in large quarters is utterly unaccustomed to scrutiny. I was listening yesterday to a senior official of the Pentagon exclaim in astonishment that the fact that the Pentagon has not been able to pass an audit doesn't mean that they're negligent or corrupt. It just means they don't know where all their stuff is or where all the money went. And the questioner said, well, hang on a minute. You don't know where all the stuff is or where all the money went. That's not great. There's American people are entitled to know. And this sort of imperious official, who an auditor obviously hadn't got within kilometres of, said, well, that's just not how it works. We get great piles of money here at the Pentagon and then we do what we like. So there is a lot of good work to be done across the American government in places, and it's not going to be all bad. But flood the zone, the opposite, one might say, of a small target strategy, Stephen, a strategy where almost Whitlamite in its activity levels, if not its ideological motivations. Trump is just dominating the news cycle with such rapidity of action. I mean, what a contrast to Biden. That's the first thing, of course, that strikes every American is, the sheer novelty of having a president who can move around and speak unassisted. But then the fact that there's just so much going on.
I was interested in a column written by James Carville. For listeners who are not familiar with Carville's work, he's a Democratic strategist who famously worked on the Clinton campaign, the Bill Clinton campaign in '92, and is a sort of a talking head these days on cable TV, both MSNBC, CNN. It goes on Fox as well, and would be regarded as a sort of a centrist, moderate Democrat.
Oh, he's a right-wing Democrat. Stop being gentle. He's fantastic.
Oh, no, I love him. I love him. The Raging Cajun, as people would know.
The Raging Cajun. Yeah.
And is a sensible talking head within the Democratic Party. And he wrote a piece that really folks should read. He was basically saying that the Republicans are very good at campaigning and they're very good at winning elections. They're not very good at governing. We've seen that under George Bush. We saw that under George W.H. Bush, the senior, and we saw that under Trump's first crack at being in the White House. His suggestion is that Democrats should shut up for a while and just let the Trump White House and the Republican Congress just stuff it up because a lot of the things that they're doing right now actually aren't the things that they said that they would do in their campaign that got them elected. Addressing the cost of living. They're not actually doing that. They're just running around because they won the election, and they're like a kid in a candy shop, and they're just gleefully having a crack at everything and under the sun that they wanted to do, but not actually trying to address the problems that voters, the undecided or persuadable voters that flipped to vote for the Republicans at the last election. And so let them completely stuff that up, give them the space to hang themselves, and then maybe around sort of January next year, as you're getting ready for the midterms, come and say, well, we let you have a crack at it. This is what they did. And now we're suffering the consequences. And so now campaign on that. But campaign on issues that are domestic, and be laser focused on your messaging that the Republicans are not addressing the issues that you were most concerned with. Obviously, he's copped a bit of heat for that. It's an interesting strategy. Just want to get your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think he said something else as well. You're right about his central point. He made an ancillary point, which is that a lot of the voices which are raised at this early juncture in opposition to Trump are voices which are intrinsically unhelpful for the Democrats. And, the USAID cuts are an example of that, where having all of these NGO, left-wing faces saying left-wing things from left-wing NGOs, the teachers union, various other characters, they're all progressive left figures, that are, stereotyped, that they look the way you expect them to look, they sound the way you expect them to sound, their complaints are what you expect them to complain about, and it just encourages rather than slows the Republicans about what course they're embarked upon. I think what America has a structural problem here, which is that it doesn't have an opposition. I think we've talked about this before.
Yeah.
So instead of there being a leader of the opposition, there really is just a miscellany of prominent Democrats across the country, randomly selected because of the positions they hold and their supposed seniority in the Democrat tribe, who become a series of faces and talking heads in opposition to Trump, who aren't in any way unified about what they're saying or what they're saying today. There's no coordination. The governor of California will have a completely different set of things to complain about than, a senior senator from Maine or whatever. So there's a structural problem. Now, in the last 4 years, the Republicans, who of course share this structural problem, were completely able to avoid it by virtue of the fact that they just had one behemoth of a guy who everyone knew was going to win the nomination, dominate Republican politics. And so for 4 years while he was out of office, Trump was effectively the leader of the opposition, just through sheer political weight. And if anyone went to the governor of Florida or Ted Cruz in Texas, they didn't for a moment imagine that they were talking to the real boss of the Republican Party, because everyone knew that guy was at Mar-a-Lago. An unusual set of affairs, but it's dominated now for some years, whereas the Democrats are still traditionally structured, not dominated by a single person, and so they don't speak with a single voice, and there's no mechanism in American politics for them to do so. So I guess to the Raging Cajun's point, their voice is going to be pretty fragmented and confused anyway, because they don't have an obvious leadership figure in the pantheon. I mean, if you wanted to get a left-wing view, you'd go to AOC. If you wanted to get a more centrist view, you might go to Buttigieg. They have their names, of course they do, but they don't have a single leader in the way that we're accustomed to in the Westminster system. And I guess another point would be that the Democrats are still going to have to go through a period of just desperately working out who they are and what they're for, and get back to basics. How do we build a more just society in a mixed market economy?
I think that, to your point about the absence of an opposition leader, I do think we underestimate a little bit the role that Nancy Pelosi played in the first Trump administration. It took them a while after Hillary lost in 2016.
Sure, but she was
it's
Speaker of the Senate.
House.
Sorry, yes, Speaker of the House, which in American politics is a very, very powerful position. Yes, if the Democrats had someone in that position, maybe.
Yeah, and the Hakeem Jeffries is meant to be the new Nancy Pelosi and is clearly not up to the task. And I guess my point is we probably
maybe with time, but Nancy was there since the Civil War.
Yeah, but I know, and she had her detractors, but I think, and I was talking to someone about this the other day, I think she is the most influential woman politician in the history of United States politics. And she's gone now, and she should be allowed to go and enjoy retirement or whatever the hell she wants to do, because she's been in there to your point, she's been there a long, long time. But I think they do miss her. And I think she did play that role, certainly all through the Trump administration. And they need that. I guess what I'm trying to say is I agree with you, David. They need that. And in fact,
she was a ward boss on the national stage. She was remarkable.
Yeah.
A Californian politician who essentially represented the sort of centre-right of the party. Those characters don't usually come out of California. A woman who in retirement...
San Francisco, no less.
A woman who could still, in retirement, could still force the sitting president to resign. Yeah, an incredible character. Well,
we're at our time. We covered off a lot today. David, once again, thank you for your contribution. I will see you at the end of March, no doubt, which will come around quicker than we think. Unless we have an election called, and then maybe we'll see you a little bit sooner than that.
I guess we are cursed to live in interesting times, Stephen. And I'd be happier if we just talked about Trump and his travails in domestic politics, but unfortunately, he struts the international stage too.
He sure does. Thanks very much.
Happy hunting.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Socially Democratic. Like the podcast, hit the follow or subscribe button, and be sure to leave a review on Apple Podcast or Podchaser, and get all the latest updates on Socially Democratic by following us on YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, Blue Sky, and LinkedIn. See you next Friday.